I have sat on this bench for more than 2 decades, and if there is one thing I have learned, it is that greed has a very specific scent. It smells like expensive perfume covering up the stench of a rot that has been growing for years. I have seen defendants walk into my courtroom with their heads held high, their smiles rehearsed, and their lies polished to a mirror shine. They walk in expecting the law to be a ladder they can climb to reach someone else's success, someone else's life, someone else's savings. But rarely have I seen someone as profoundly detached from reality as the woman who stood before me that Tuesday morning. Her name was Cassandra Vance. She was young, perfectly groomed, and carried an air of entitlement that was so thick, it felt as though she had brought her own atmospheric pressure into the room. She was wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than the plaintiff's annual pension. Beside her sat her attorney, a man who seemed to view this entire proceeding as a tedious interruption of his lunch hour. They didn't look like people who had come to seek justice. They looked like people who had come to collect a dividend. Across the aisle sat Martha Gable. She was 90 years old. She was small, the kind of small that comes from decades of bending to the will of life without ever breaking. She wore a coat that had seen better days, a soft, faded wool garment that she held closed with a steady, weathered hand. She sat on the edge of her chair, her back straight as an arrow, though I could see the tremor in her knuckles. On her lap, gripped as if it were a shield against the cruelty of the world, was a small, worn-out leather purse. Its corners were worn down to the white backing, and the brass clasp had long since lost its gold plating, revealing the dull, honest iron beneath. That purse was the most expensive thing in the room, not in terms of currency, but in terms of what it represented. It wasn't just a bag, it was a testament. It was a repository of 90 years of holding on, of saving, of surviving wars, losses, and the slow, inevitable erosion of time. It was the only thing Martha had left, aside from the dignity she wore like armor. When the proceedings began, Cassandra spoke with a cold, clipped precision. She didn't look at Martha. She looked past her, at the wall, at the ceiling, anywhere but into the eyes of the woman she was accused of systematically stripping bare. She told a story of a loving arrangement, of a voluntary donation given to her for the emotional labor she provided to a lonely, elderly neighbor. She spun a web of words designed to frame theft as charity. She claimed Martha was confused, that she was forgetful, that her age had rendered her perception of reality unreliable. I watched Martha while these words were spoken. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply sat there, her hands folded over that battered purse, her knuckles turning white as the accusations of her own incompetence hit the air. It is a terrible thing to watch a predator try to convince a judge that the prey is the one who is broken. But I am not easily convinced, and I am certainly not blind. As Cassandra finished her rehearsed narrative, a silence fell over the court. It was a heavy, expectant silence. And in that stillness, Martha slowly shifted the weight of her purse, and for the first time, she looked up at me. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a request for truth. I could see the impatience radiating off Cassandra. She checked her watch, a timepiece that probably cost more than Martha's annual Social Security check. She was bored. This was a nuisance to her, a speed bump on the road to her next acquisition. She didn't realize that in my courtroom, boredom is the first symptom of a case going sideways. I turned my attention back to Martha. She was still sitting perfectly still, her hands trembling slightly against the faded leather of that purse. It was a small thing, really. It looked like it had been carried through a dozen winters, its leather cracked and polished by the friction of 1,000 days of use. "Miss Gable," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "I knew that when you are 90, the world can feel very loud and very fast. I wanted her to know that here, the world would move at her pace. You claim that this wasn't a donation. You claim that this was a transaction, a payment for services that were never rendered. But in a court of law, claims are just words. Do you have anything to show me what happened that day? Anything that links this woman to your money?" Cassandra smirked. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement of the lips, but I caught it. It was the smirk of someone who knew the outcome. She had likely intimidated Martha into silence before they even reached the building. She had banked on the fact that an elderly woman would have no record, no paper trail, no digital footprint to substantiate the theft of her savings. She thought Martha was a ghost of a person, someone whose reality could be rewritten by a stronger, younger voice. Martha didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the purse again, her fingers tracing the clasp. I watched those fingers. They were spotted with age, the skin thin as parchment, but they moved with a reverence that told me the contents were sacred. She looked up at me, her eyes clouded with the cataracts of time, but sharp with a clarity that only survivors possess. She didn't look at Cassandra. She didn't even acknowledge the attorney's patronizing grin. She just opened that purse. The sound of the clasp snapping open seemed to echo in the rafters of the courtroom. It was the sound of a gate unlocking. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the bench. I have seen thousands of people open their bags in this court. Usually, they produce bank statements, legal notices, or crumpled receipts. But Martha didn't reach for a document. She reached deep into the dark interior of that purse, her hand disappearing past the wrist, searching for something she had tucked away like a secret. The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. Even the bailiff, a man who has heard every lie in the book, took a half-step closer. Cassandra's smirk faltered for the first time. She didn't know what was in that purse, and that was her mistake. In the world of the arrogant, they assume they know everything. They never account for the things they can't see. Martha withdrew her hand and held it out. It wasn't a stack of cash, and it wasn't a legal summons. It was a small, spiral-bound notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $1. Its cover was fraying at the edges, and the ink on the front had faded to a ghostly gray. Martha held it out with both hands, her grip surprisingly firm, as if the book contained the gravity of a life lived by the truth. I motioned for the bailiff to take it. As he walked toward the bench, horror in the room felt suddenly thin. Cassandra's lawyer finally stopped his dismissive whispering and leaned forward, his professional veneer cracking. He sensed what I sensed, that this was the end of the narrative they had constructed. I opened the notebook. The handwriting inside was shaky, the cursive of a generation taught that every word matters. On the first page, there was a date. It was from 2 years ago. Beside it, an amount, $500. And next to that, a signature. I leaned back, my eyes narrowing. It was unmistakably Cassandra Vance's signature. Page after page, the story unfolded in columns of ink. Each entry was a date, a time, and a specific dollar amount, recorded with the meticulous discipline of someone who had never wasted a penny in their life. This wasn't just a diary of expenses. It was a cold, hard ledger of exploitation. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls, addressing Cassandra's attorney without taking my eyes off the book. "Your client claimed this was a gift, a voluntary, charitable contribution to her organization." I tapped the page, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Then why is every entry signed for? Why is there a note next to the June entry that says, and I quote, 'For the lawn work and the groceries, signed C. Vance'?" The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Cassandra's face went pale. The arrogance that had defined her entrance was evaporating, replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. She looked at her attorney, pleading with her eyes for him to do something, to object, to interrupt, to save her. But he was frozen, staring at the notebook as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. It's a misunderstanding, Your Honor," Cassandra stammered, her voice lacking the crisp confidence it had held 10 minutes ago. She didn't understand the context. "Context?" I snapped, the gavel heavy in my hand. "The context is written in ink, ma'am. You didn't just take her money. You took her record-keeping. You took her trust. And you clearly underestimated her intelligence. You thought that because she was 90, she didn't know the value of what she was holding. You were wrong. In this courtroom, we value character over status, and right now, your character is worth exactly 0. I looked back at Martha. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting on the edge of her seat, clutching her purse. For the first time, a small, tired smile touched her lips. She didn't need to say a word. The book had spoken for her. Cassandra, however, was clearly beginning to realize that the name she relied on to protect her was about to become the very thing that dragged her down. I flipped the pages again, my jaw set. It was all there, recorded in blue ballpoint pen, the lifeblood of a woman who had spent decades working to save a modest nest egg, now being siphoned off by someone who looked at her and saw nothing but a target. Every withdrawal matched the dates Martha had told me about earlier. It was a roadmap of exploitation. I looked up at the defense table. The attorney was no longer leaning back. He was sitting up, frantically flipping through his own papers, looking for a way out of a burning building. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air of the courtroom like a blade, I assume you have an explanation for why your client's signature is plastered all over a ledger detailing the systematic emptying of a 90-year-old woman's life savings? Or should I just go ahead and call the district attorney's office right now? The attorney cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep, uncomfortable crimson. Your Honor, these payments were clearly labeled as reimbursements. Miss Vance was providing companionship, grocery shopping, and home maintenance. These were voluntary contributions for her time. There is no theft here. I felt my blood pressure rise, that familiar, righteous anger that has fueled my career for decades. I didn't let him finish. Don't you dare insult my intelligence, counselor, I barked, my gavel coming down with a finality that silenced every murmur in the gallery. This is not companionship. This is a predator disguised as a neighbor. A reimbursement for grocery shopping doesn't cost $800 a week. A voluntary contribution doesn't involve forging signatures on withdrawal slips to cover your tracks. I turned my gaze to Cassandra. The mask of the refined, professional young woman had shattered. She was trembling now, her eyes darting around the room, desperately looking for an exit, a sympathetic look, anything. But she found none. She was surrounded by the evidence of her own greed, laid out in the shaky, honest handwriting of the woman she had exploited. Miss Vance, I addressed her directly, my voice low and dangerous. You looked at this woman, you saw her loneliness, and you decided it was an opportunity. You sat in her kitchen, drank her tea, and while she was looking the other way, you were stealing her future. You thought she was old, invisible, and forgetful. You thought she would die before she ever had the strength to challenge you in a court of law. You were wrong, and you have grossly underestimated the fire that still burns in a woman who has survived everything else. Cassandra tried to speak, her voice cracking. I was only trying to help her. She asked me to— Stop, I interrupted. The ledger is not a request. The ledger is a record of an extraction. You have spent your time in this court trying to paint this woman as a senile, confused burden. But it is very clear to me who the confused party is. You were confused about one thing. You thought you were the smartest person in the room. You are not. And as of this moment, you are the most exposed person in the room. I looked over at the bailiff who was standing at attention, his face as stoic as stone. I want the court to ensure that this ledger is marked as Exhibit A, and I want the clerk to prepare a copy for the authorities. We are done here with the civil aspect of this case, because what I am looking at is a criminal enterprise. Cassandra's knees began to buckle. The bailiff, a veteran of these chambers who had seen countless arrogant defendants crumble, didn't need to be told twice. He stepped subtly between the defendant and the exit, a silent sentry ensuring no one was leaving early. The confidence that had draped over her like a designer cloak just minutes ago was now nothing but rags. She looked around the room, desperately seeking a lifeline, a sympathetic glance, or a way to spin this back in her favor, but found only the cold, unyielding stares of the gallery. Even the people who had accompanied her organization associates, had moved their chairs inches away, distancing themselves from the stench of a sinking ship. I wasn't done. I didn't want to just win this civil dispute. I wanted to break the structure that allowed such cruelty to flourish. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the defendant. She looked small now, stripped of the bravado that had brought her here. Miss Vance, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air, you seem to think that because you are young and articulate, you can rewrite the life of a woman who has lived through history you couldn't even dream of. You saw her as a bank account. I see her as a citizen who has earned her peace. I motioned to my clerk, who handed me a thin file, the preliminary research on her so-called charity. It was a hollow shell, a front for something far more sinister. Let's talk about your outreach program, I continued, reading from the document. A nonprofit that does everything except support people. You used it as a funnel, a tax-exempt vacuum cleaner for the life savings of the elderly. And the funny thing is, Cassandra, you aren't the first one to try this. You're just the one who was stupid enough to get caught by a 90-year-old with a better memory than you. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. The defense attorney was now staring at his own shoes, realizing that his hourly rate was not going to buy his client out of this. He knew that the moment I had taken that ledger, the case had ceased to be a simple contract dispute. It was now a roadmap of a criminal enterprise. I have looked at the names in your file, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You didn't just target Martha, you had a list of widowers, of retirees living alone, of veterans. You treated their grief like a commodity. You didn't study their needs. You studied their vulnerabilities. You mapped out their lives to see exactly when they would be most susceptible to your lies. Cassandra started to sob, a jagged, ugly sound. You don't understand, she choked out. I had expenses. You needed to be a human being, and you failed, I snapped, the gavel coming down with a finality that silenced every murmur in the room. You don't get to stand in my courtroom and plead for understanding when you spent years perfecting the art of taking from those who have the least. Compassion isn't something you turn on like a faucet when you get caught. It's a way of living, and clearly, it's a language you've never learned to speak. Mr. Henderson, the defense attorney, slowly unhooked his lapel mic and set it on the table. It was the universal gesture of surrender. He knew when a case had transformed from a legal defense into a public relations disaster, and his client's reputation was already beyond saving. He looked at me, then at Cassandra, and finally at the floor. Your Honor, he began, his voice devoid of the arrogance that had filled the room 30 minutes ago. In light of the evidence presented, specifically the ledger and the nature of the transactions, my client has requested to consult with independent counsel regarding her criminal exposure. I didn't blink. You do whatever you need to do, Mr. Henderson, but do not mistake my patience for leniency. This court is not a place where you can pivot when the truth becomes inconvenient. You brought this case here. You stood by while your client attempted to paint this woman as senile to cover up a calculated theft. That, in my book, is a violation of the ethics this profession is built upon. I shifted my gaze back to Cassandra. She was no longer sobbing. She was paralyzed. It is a terrifying moment for a predator when they realize the environment has shifted and they are no longer the one hunting. She had relied on the assumption that Martha's age was a wall she could hide behind, a barrier that would keep anyone from looking too closely at the numbers. But greed is a sloppy business. It leaves footprints everywhere if you look hard enough. You thought you were smarter than everyone else in this room, I said, my voice steady, the courtroom hanging on every syllable. You thought you could buy a narrative and sell it to this bench. You treated Martha's life like a personal ATM, and you did it with a smile on your face. That is not just a mistake. That is a fundamental failure of character. Power and youth are not shields for bad behavior. In my courtroom, status does not grant immunity. The gallery was a mix of shocked gasps and murmurs. A young woman in the back row was wiping tears from her eyes, and for a second, I saw the collective realization in the room. We were witnessing the absolute collapse of a false persona. Cassandra Vance, who had walked in with the gait of a queen, was now effectively nothing more than a cautionary tale. I leaned forward, the wood of the bench cool against my arms. Martha, I said, my voice softening just enough to bypass the sternness of the law. You came here today asking for what was yours. You held on to that ledger not because you were greedy, but because you knew the value of the truth. You stood alone against someone you thought had every advantage. And you won. Martha looked up, and for the first time, a tear escaped. It wasn't a tear of weakness. It was the release of a burden she had been carrying alone in the dark. She reached into her purse, that same worn, honest purse, and pulled out a single small photograph. She didn't hold it out. She just touched it to her lips. It was a picture of her late husband. He told me, Your Honor, she whispered, her voice rasping but audible in the heavy silence, that the truth is the only thing that doesn't age. The air in the courtroom had turned stagnant, heavy with the realization that the game was truly over. The ledger sat on the bench, a simple, spiral-bound book that had effectively dismantled an entire life built on lies. It was a tangible testament to years of manipulation, a paper trail that Cassandra Vance had never considered would be kept, let alone brought into a court of law. She sat frozen, her designer suit now appearing like a costume she had forgotten how to wear. Miss Vance, I said, my voice echoing, devoid of the warmth I had initially offered. You came into this court with a story. You claimed you were a helper, a charitable soul. You claimed this woman was confused. But this notebook, this is not the record of a confused mind. This is the record of a woman who knew exactly what was being taken from her and why. She kept this record not for herself, but as a silent witness to your arrogance. Cassandra tried to speak, but her throat seemed to have closed up. She looked small, stripped of the bravado that had filled the room only moments before. It is a terrifying moment for a predator when they realize the environment has shifted and they are no longer the one hunting. She had relied on the assumption that Martha's age was a wall she could hide behind, a barrier that would keep anyone from looking too closely at the numbers. But greed is a sloppy business. It leaves footprints everywhere if you look hard enough. Mr. Henderson, I turned to her counsel, who was now meticulously avoiding eye contact with both me and his client. Do you have anything left to say? Or are we ready to move this matter to the hands of the police, where it belongs? The attorney stood, his voice barely a whisper. Your Honor, in light of the evidence, we concede the claim. I didn't let him retreat that easily. Concede? That's a very polite word for a crime, counselor. You don't concede when you've been caught stealing a life savings. You face the consequences. I looked down at Martha. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting on the edge of her seat, clutching that photograph of her husband like a prayer. For the first time, a small, tired smile touched her lips. She didn't need to say a word. The ledger had spoken for her. Cassandra, however, was clearly beginning to realize that the name and the connections she relied on to protect her were about to become the very thing that dragged her down. The weight of the room was crushing, a palpable force of justice, finally tipping the scales back to where they belonged. Martha, I said, my voice softening just enough to bypass the sternness of the law. You came here today asking for what was yours. You held on to that ledger not because you were greedy, but because you knew the value of the truth. You stood alone against someone you thought had every advantage. And you won. Cassandra Vance, I said, resonating with the weight of the law, you are done here. The judgment for the plaintiff, Martha Gable, is for the full amount of the stolen funds, plus punitive damages that will ensure you don't even have a dime left to your name. But do not make the mistake of thinking this is the end of your trouble. My clerk is handing over the entire file, the ledger, and the transcript of this hearing to the district attorney's office. They have a very specific, very serious name for what you've been doing: felony fraud and elder abuse. You'll soon be trading that designer suit for a uniform that doesn't fit nearly as well, and it won't be made by anyone on the runways you seem so fond of. Cassandra stared at me, her mouth agape, the color entirely drained from her face. She looked like she had just been told the world was ending, and for her, in every way that mattered, it was. The attorney beside her had slumped, his head in his hands, clearly already calculating the impossibility of defending a client who had left a written ledger of her crimes. Martha, I turned to the plaintiff, my tone softening into genuine respect. You didn't just come here to win a case today. You came here to reclaim your life. You are a reminder to everyone in this room, and everyone watching, that age is not a weakness, and silence is not consent. You stood alone against someone you thought had every advantage, and you proved that truth has a power that greed can never match. Martha stood up, a little shakily, but with a grace that Cassandra could never replicate. She clutched the photograph of her husband to her chest, her expression finally peaceful. It was the face of a woman who had fought a war and won, not with weapons, but with the quiet, persistent accumulation of the truth. I waited until the bailiff had escorted Cassandra out of the room. She was ushered out like the common thief she was, stripped of the influence she thought she possessed. The courtroom seemed to exhale, and for those of you at home, I said, looking directly into the camera, my expression stern but earnest, look at this woman. Look at what she has endured. There are people in your life, in your neighborhood, who are just like Martha. They are invisible until they need us. They are grieving, they are trusting, and they are waiting for someone to pay attention. Justice doesn't always start with a verdict from a judge. It starts with anyone choosing to pay attention. Don't look past them. Don't assume that because someone is old, they are obsolete. Because as Martha has shown us today, a single life and the truth it carries is enough to bring down the most confident of predators. I slammed the gavel down one last time. Court is adjourned.